They say history began in Mesopotamia. That civilization was born in the Fertile Crescent, with the first bricks, the first laws, the first writing pressed into wet clay under a Sumerian sun. That before that, there was nothing. No cities, no science, no story. But what if that's not true? What if that's just where the records start, not where the story begins? Tonight, we begin not with what was found, but with what was forgotten. Because scattered across deserts, jungles, and oceans lie traces of something far older. Traces of a time before time. A world that once flourished, but left no name. A world remembered not in textbooks, but in whispers, in myths, in ruins, in impossible alignments between stone and star. This is not about fantasy. This is about memory. About the terrifying possibility that humanity was once far more advanced than we believe, and that what we now call progress might only be a return to something already lost. From Göbekli Tepe to submerged cities beneath the sea, from ancient machines to myths that speak of skyfire and maps of a world yet to be explored, the deeper we look, the more impossible it becomes to believe this is our first rise. This is the story of what came before us, and why it vanished, not by natural disaster, not by accident, but perhaps by design. Because if you could erase a civilization, you could also erase the proof that it ever existed. And so tonight, we descend not into the darkness of ignorance, but into a silence more chilling, the silence of a forgotten world. One that may have once held answers we still don't dare to ask. Let's begin where the cracks first show. Not in temples, not in bones, but in the shape of our own memory. If Homo sapiens have existed for over 200,000 years, then why have we only been civilized for the last 6,000? What were we doing for the other 194,000? We're told we were hunters, nomads, scavengers of bone and fire, that for nearly 200 millennia, we simply wandered the earth. Until suddenly, without clear reason, we built cities, learned astronomy, created agriculture, and began writing the story of us. But something about that never felt right. Because nature doesn't leap, it evolves. Language doesn't arrive in a decade. It unfolds over centuries. Science doesn't emerge out of instinct. It takes inheritance, memory passed down, built upon. And yet we're told all of this. Language, astronomy, writing, math, emerged out of nowhere. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe it didn't come from nowhere at all. Maybe it came from a world that already knew, but was forgotten. Forgotten not because we lost the ability, but because we lost access to the past. Across the ancient world, a pattern appears again and again. Myths of a golden age before the fall. Stories of gods who walked the earth, not as deities, but as teachers. Tales of destruction, not from above, but from within. What if these weren't myths? What if they were memories? And what if the real question isn't whether a civilization existed before ours, but who erased it, and why? From this moment forward, every answer leads deeper. The evidence is scattered, fragmented, but real. And when placed side by side, it begins to speak, not with certainty, but with a question that can no longer be silenced. What was the world before this world? And what truth did it leave behind? We begin with the stones, not the ones placed by modern hands, but those buried deep beneath the earth, the ones no one was supposed to find. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd in southeastern Turkey stumbled upon something strange poking through the dirt. At first it looked like an old rock, But the excavation that followed would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. Or at least, it should have. Because what they found was Göbekli Tepe, a series of stone circles, massive in scale, intricately carved, and aligned with the stars. Carbon dating placed it at 11,600 years old, 6,000 years before the pyramids, 7,000 years before Stonehenge. But here's the mystery. Göbekli Tepe was not the work of wandering hunters. It was the work of engineers, astronomers, and builders who understood precision, who had a plan. And yet, no pottery, no farming tools, no signs of a settled village nearby. How could people who supposedly had no agriculture, no cities, no written language, have built something that complex? Unless they weren't the first, unless they were inheriting knowledge from somewhere, or someone else. And then there's the strangest detail of all. After completing Göbekli Tepe, these ancient builders buried it, carefully, intentionally, layer upon layer of sand and stone, preserving it like a time capsule. But why? Who builds a monument meant to last forever, only to hide it from history? Unless they knew what was coming, unless something or someone was already working to erase the past. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across the globe, in places where history books say nothing existed, we find structures no one can explain. In India, the city of Dwarka, once thought to be myth, was discovered submerged beneath the Arabian Sea, with symmetrical blocks, staircases, and roads preserved beneath the waves. In Bolivia, Tiwanaku and its companion site Pumapunku show evidence of stones cut with a precision rivaling modern lasers, interlocking joints with no mortar, and granite blocks weighing over 100 tons, moved across miles of high-altitude terrain. No one knows how, no one agrees when, and most textbooks don't even ask the question. And then there's Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan, a massive underwater formation resembling step pyramids, walls, and corridors, deep beneath the ocean. Some call it natural, others ancient architecture. But whether it's a lost city or a sculpted reef, it raises a troubling question. If civilizations were rising before the last ice age, what else lies beneath the sea? Because when the glaciers melted, sea levels rose over 400 feet. Entire coastlines vanished, and any culture that lived near the water, the lifeblood of ancient humanity, was simply washed away. No war, no fire, just silence. And perhaps that's why we don't find more evidence. Because we're looking in the wrong places. On land, not beneath the waves. In written history, not in the myths. Because while the ruins crumble, the stories remain. Stories that whisper of a lost age. The Hopi people speak of previous worlds, destroyed and reborn. The Dogon of Mali tell of visitors who came from the sky to teach geometry and astronomy. The ancient Sumerians wrote of gods who brought kingship from the heavens. But in the quiet spaces between the lines, another possibility emerges. Maybe these weren't gods. Maybe they were the last survivors of a previous world, one that had risen, reached heights we still don't understand, and then vanished. Not by chance, not by failure, but by force. Because what if there is a pattern, not one of progress, but of suppression, a cycle not of evolution, but of forgetting? Again and again, the same story echoes. A great flood, a fall from grace, a sacred knowledge lost, and always, the survivors, left behind to start again. What if we are those survivors? And what if the ruins aren't what remain, but what escaped? The ruins speak in stone, but they do not shout. They whisper. And when we lean in close enough to listen, to really listen, we begin to realize something haunting. It's not that the voices of the past are missing, it's that they were deliberately quieted. Because the most important part of any disappearance is the silence that follows. What does that silence conceal? Take a moment. Look at the oldest structures still standing. They do not crumble. They endure. Pyramids in Egypt, Mesoamerica, China, massive stone platforms in Peru and Polynesia, aligned not with earthly kingdoms, but with the stars. Again and again, the same shapes appear across the planet: pyramids, circles, cosmic axes, cultures that supposedly never met, using the same patterns, the same alignments, the same sacred numbers. Why? Because they were taught, or because they remembered? Across continents, these first architects weren't building cities. They were building messages. Messages not in words, but in geometry, stone, and celestial precision. Messages designed to outlast memory. In ancient Sanskrit, the word for temple is mandir, a place where the eternal and the earthly align. In Egypt, the original word for pyramid translates roughly to the house of the horizon. In Mesoamerica, temples were called teocalli, god houses, observatories, star mirrors. Not just places of worship, places of alignment between heaven and earth, between time and truth. But what were they aligning to? What were they marking? In 1997, researchers studying the Giza pyramids noticed something strange. When mapped precisely, the three main pyramids didn't align perfectly north-south. They aligned with something else: the belt of Orion, a constellation, and not as it appeared in their time, but as it had appeared thousands of years earlier. Could they have remembered a sky that old? Or were they told? Were they copying something already ancient? And Giza is not alone. The Pyramid of Teotihuacan in Mexico, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and the temple complexes in Malta, each mirror the stars above, each encode knowledge that took generations of observation to perfect. But here's the riddle. If civilization had only just begun, who had the time to measure the heavens? To track precession, solstices, equinoxes, things that require centuries of data, unless they weren't the first, unless they were remembering or rebuilding. And yet, we are told they were primitive, that they lacked tools, that they didn't understand what they were doing, because the truth is too uncomfortable. Because if we admit they were advanced, we must ask, advanced from what? And suddenly the silence returns. Archaeology moves on. Textbooks close. Sites are left unexcavated, or worse, are hidden behind fences, politics, and permits that never come. Because once you start looking too closely, you start seeing things you're not supposed to see, like the uncanny precision of megalithic walls in Peru, stones that interlock like puzzle pieces, shaped without mortar, immune to earthquakes, or the Sphinx, weathered not by wind or sand, but by water. Deep vertical erosion that suggests a time before the desert, before 10,000 BCE, older than history, older than Egypt. And yet, it stands, silently, watching. The architects of this world are gone, but their structures remain, not as homes, not as graves, but as reminders. Reminders of something we don't understand. Reminders that knowledge does not always rise in a straight line. Sometimes it falls, and sometimes it's pushed. So ask yourself, if a civilization rose once before, what would it take to bury it so deeply that no one could prove it existed? And more importantly, who would benefit from that kind of forgetting? They tell us the ancients were dreamers, superstitious, poets of stone and myth. that they built monuments to gods they didn't understand, using tools they could barely hold. But when you strip away the dust, when you measure what they built, you don't find dreams. You find data. Because buried beneath the carvings, the geometry, the sacred alignments, lies a language, one we almost forgot how to read. And maybe that's not an accident. Take the Great Pyramid. Not its legends, its numbers. Its base forms a near-perfect square, aligned within 1/15th of a degree to true north, a feat modern architects struggle to match. Its height, multiplied by a specific ratio, mirrors the polar radius of the Earth. Its perimeter encodes the value of pi, long before the Greeks ever defined it. Its volume and weight correspond to units of measurement used in astronomy and geodesy. But here's the strangest thing. No hieroglyphs inside. No king's name carved into the stone. No builder claiming credit. Just silence. As if the pyramid wasn't a tomb, but a device. Not for the dead, but for the stars. And Giza is only the beginning. In India's ancient temples, stone pillars are tuned to musical notes. In Malta, the underground complex of Halsaflieni echoes sound in harmonic resonance, tuned to the human voice. In Cambodia, Angkor Wat's layout mirrors the movement of Venus. In Mexico, the Temple of Kukulkan casts a shadow serpent on the equinox. In Iraq, a clay battery dated 2,000 years before Edison. These aren't random tricks of nature. They are technologies. Primitive, number just unfamiliar. And in that unfamiliarity, we find a strange truth. The deeper we look, the more we realize the past isn't behind us. It's beneath us, hidden not by time, but by choice. Because as civilizations rose, knowledge was preserved and then erased, again and again. Science is not new, it is reborn. And sometimes what we call discovery is merely rediscovery. The Antikythera mechanism, pulled from a shipwreck in the Aegean Sea, shocked historians. A complex gear-based machine capable of predicting eclipses, planetary motion, and lunar phases, over 2,000 years old. Nothing like it was seen again for over a millennium. It shouldn't exist. But it does. And it forces us to ask, what else once existed and was lost? Because it's not just that ancient science was buried once. It was buried twice, once by time, and once more by intent. When libraries burned, not from war, but from decree. When texts were rewritten, pagan knowledge translated, redacted, erased. When councils met not to preserve truth, but to define it. When what could not be controlled was destroyed. The Library of Alexandria, the manuscripts of Nalanda, the scrolls of Pergamon, each flame burned knowledge older than the books themselves. Not just facts, but worldviews, and in their place a new version of history was written. One that began at a more convenient moment, with more convenient heroes, and no mention of the world that came before. Because if humanity once reached heights we can't explain, then what we call progress is not a climb, but a return. And that idea, that we are not the first to rise, is dangerous. Dangerous not because it's false, but because it might be true. And the deeper danger is this. If we were advanced once before, why did we fall? What force or decision shattered the first memory of science? And why does that silence still echo now? Every story has a break, a point where the thread snaps and something changes, quietly, permanently. For humanity, that fracture didn't leave behind broken cities or burned maps. It left behind something more dangerous, a perfectly clean slate. No ruins in sight, no records in reach. Just the sudden appearance of the first civilization as if history had been waiting for the right people to start writing it. But no beginning is that tidy. No origin is that smooth. Which means the fracture wasn't an accident. It was a choice. And the closer we look, the more that choice begins to take shape. When Rome collapsed in the West, Europe didn't just lose an empire, it lost its memory. Schools were shuttered, libraries abandoned, philosophers vanished, and in their place, the church rose. What followed was not just a dark age, it was a reset. Knowledge that didn't serve the new order was labeled heresy. Books that carried the wrong truths were burned, languages simplified, science reduced to faith. And slowly, century by century, the ancient world faded. Not with a scream, but with silence. But here's the deeper mystery. That silence wasn't unique to Europe. It happened again and again, across continents, across empires. In South Asia, Buddhist monasteries once held thousands of manuscripts, medical texts, philosophical debates, astronomical tables. They vanished in fire. In China, entire libraries were ordered burned by emperors who wanted one truth, not many. In Mesoamerica, Mayan codices were thrown into flames by conquistadors who could not read them and feared what they might say. And then, perhaps most quietly of all, the Vatican archives, 85 kilometers of shelves, 12 centuries of sealed documents, records not erased, but locked away. Ask yourself, why preserve something only to hide it? Unless it tells a story the world wasn't meant to remember. And at the heart of that story is a question no one dares to ask. Who benefits from forgetting? Because forgetting isn't passive. It's a tool, a form of power. If you control what people remember, you control what they believe. And if you erase the past, you become the author of the future. It wasn't just the knowledge of stone and star that vanished. It was permission to think beyond the approved story, to believe we were more, to imagine we came from more. Because if the world knew, if children were taught that once, humanity had mastered the skies, had mapped the stars, had understood frequency, vibration, energy, and then lost it all, what would they believe about what's possible now? What would they demand? What would they become? And so the fracture remained, silent, buried, until now. Because something strange is happening. The ruins are rising again. Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids of Cradle, Sundaland, Gunung Padang, the Bimini Road. Structures once dismissed as natural are being re-examined. Timelines once etched in stone are being redrawn, and in the cracks of that old, clean slate, the truth is leaking through, not as revelation, but as remembering. And maybe that's all it ever takes. A few questions, a few voices, a few lights, moving through the dark. We've searched the ruins. We've studied the silence. We've traced the outlines of a civilization that rose before memory and fell before myth. But now, we come to the most uncomfortable truth of all. It never truly vanished. Because what is forgotten is not the same as what is gone. Even after a forest burns, the roots remain. And even after memory is buried, the soul of it waits. It waits in symbols passed down through generations, in stories whispered before sleep. In architectures we don't fully understand, but still try to imitate. In the pull we feel toward stars we no longer name. And now, for the first time in centuries, those roots are pushing back through the soil. Because something in us remembers, not in words, not in facts, but in that quiet, aching sense that we are missing something. A sense that the story we've been told is smaller than it should be, that the world used to be bigger, not in space but in meaning. And maybe we used to be too. Look around. Why are we drawn to lost cities, ancient maps, forgotten gods? Why do we feel a pull toward megaliths we've never seen, scripts we can't read, temples swallowed by jungle? Why does a simple stone circle under the stars make us feel like we've come home? Because on some level, we have. Because what we call ancient knowledge is not gone. It's incomplete. It's waiting. Not to be discovered, but to be reunited with what we already carry inside us. What if the most sacred truths were never written in stone, but in us, our intuition, our creativity, our strange, relentless desire to understand the stars, to build, to wonder, to remember? Perhaps that's the final secret of the first humans, that they knew we would forget, and so they left us a trail, a resonance, a geometry, a story encoded not in books, but in the bones of the earth itself. And maybe they didn't vanish at all. Maybe they became us, and the fire we carry, the yearning to know, to reach, to build, to transcend, is not the beginning of a new age, but the return of an old one, a memory coming home. So now we must ask, if humanity is not ascending for the first time, but rising again, what will we do differently? Will we burn the libraries again? Will we bury the knowledge? Will we fear what we cannot control? Or will we listen to the ruins, to the stars, to the silence that is not empty, but full of voices, full of warnings, full of truth, waiting for us to be brave enough to hear it? Because history is not a straight line, it's a spiral. And if we've been here before, then maybe, just maybe, this time we'll remember.